subscribe and click the bell icon to turn on notifications.
We've made the files the instructor uses in this tutorial available for free. Just click the link below in the video details to get these.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on macros and basic VBA in Excel. I hope everyone is doing good as always from wherever in the world you're joining us from today. Now, I know that we normally get quite a lot of regulars on this call, but if we do have any new people who have never come across me before, then my name is Deborah Ashby and I'm a Microsoft IT trainer. And I basically specialize in the design, delivery and facilitation of Microsoft training, both online and in the classroom. And I'm quite excited today because we are covering a topic that we haven't done it for a really long time. I can't even remember the last time we did a webinar on VBA or macros or anything along those lines. So this is going to be quite nice. But I would say that these two topics are possibly a bit more on the advanced end of Excel. Although saying that, we are going to stick with some of the more basic topics in this webinar. And as always, we're going to start from the beginning and work our way up. So even if you have no experience with macros or VBA, you should still be able to follow along with what I'm doing. It's not going to get extremely complicated. So let's jump in and take a quick look at today's agenda. This is what we're going to cover. So we're going to start out just by discussing exactly what macros are, just so that everybody has a clear understanding. I'm then going to show you quite a few examples of macros in action. So I've set up about 7 or so already in a worksheet, and I'm just going to run them and show you how they work. I'm then going to talk to you a little bit about VBA. And again, if you've never used VBA, don't worry at all. Everything's going to be explained as we go through. We're then going to go into how we can record, save, and run a macro. And I'm going to show you how you can record a macro with relative referencing. Once we've done that, we're then going to move on to taking a look at a slightly more complex macro where we're kind of joining together lots of different procedures into one. I'm going to show you the VBA editor window. So as you get more confident in your VBA skills, you can dive into there and start making changes to your code to get your macros to behave in different ways. I'm going to show you how Excel builds your VBA code when you're creating a macro. And I'm going to show you how you can make minor edits to your VBA code. Nothing too scary or too extraordinary, but just little things just to help you understand exactly what it is that you're looking at. And then finally, I'm just going to show you a couple of cool things you can do to make your worksheets a bit more interactive using macros by assigning them to things like buttons, form controls, icons, and pictures. So that's what we're going to go through in this session. So let's come out of here. We don't need that thank you slide just yet. And I'm going to dive across to the first Excel spreadsheet that we're going to be using. So let's start out with that all-important question, what exactly is a macro? Well, a macro is really just a fancy term that really just describes the process of automating tasks. So for example, maybe every week you find yourself putting together a report in Excel, and maybe that report shows weekly sales figures. And each week you open up a brand new Excel spreadsheet, you type in the report title, maybe you then apply some formatting to that title, you then input your sales figures, maybe you create a chart or apply some conditional formatting. All of these are different steps that you have to take in order to get to your end result. Now, what a macro will allow you to do is basically save a lot of time, depending on how long the task is, by automating all of those steps. So instead of having to run through that process each time you create this report, you can click one button and it's going to do everything for you essentially. So it automates time-consuming tasks. That's the best way to look at it. So what I'm going to show you first of all are just a few examples of macros in action. So I've got quite a few tabs at the bottom here, and on this first worksheet, this is the delete blank rows worksheet. I just have some data, it has some blank rows in it, and I've created a macro that's going to automate the task of removing those blank rows. Now, my macros are stored on the developer tab. Now, I'm going to go through this in a bit more detail so you know exactly what you're looking at. They're in the macros button, and these are all the macros that I have stored in this particular worksheet. And I've already created these ahead of time. So what I'm going to do here is choose the delete blank rows macro. I'm going to click run, and you'll see that like magic, it runs and it gets rid of all of those blank rows from this data. If I go across to the next worksheet, I now want to run a macro that's going to apply accounting formatting to whichever cells I've selected. So if I select these columns just here, which contain values, I can then jump back into my macros. I'm going to use my accounting format macro, which is the one at the top, click run, and it's going to apply that accounting formatting. What about on the next worksheet? Well, here, what I want to do is I want to format this data as a table. So instead of running through the process of doing that, I can again use a macro that I've already created. I can run it and it applies that formatting to this data. Moving across, what about this one? Well, here I have some basic, again, maybe some sales figures for Q1 to Q4 across the different months of the year. And then I have some total values at the end. And if you take a look in the formula bar, you can see that where I'm clicked, I have formulas sitting behind these cells. Now, maybe I want to get rid of these formulas by doing a paste of the values. So instead of going up to paste special and searching for paste values, I've set up a macro that's going to quickly do that for me. So I can select the cells just here, go back to developer, macros, and I can choose paste values, click run. And now when I click on the cells in here, if you look at the formula bar, you can see we no longer have a sum calculation there because we just have the values. Let's take a look at another example. Maybe I want to apply some conditional formatting to these cells in here. I'm going to go back to macros. I've set up a little data bars macro, which I can run to apply those very quickly. Another example would be something like removing hyperlinks. So if I just want to make these regular text and not clickable links, I've got another macro that's going to do that for me called remove hyperlink. What about something like creating a new worksheet? Now, this isn't a particularly long process. You can press the Control-N keyboard shortcut, but just to show you that it doesn't necessarily have to be processes working within one worksheet. You can also use it for things like creating new worksheets, opening things, printing, stuff like that. So if I go back to macros, and I think I have a new worksheet one in here. Yes, I do. Click on Run, and you'll see at the bottom of the screen, I now have a new sheet, Sheet 1. Final couple of examples, highlight cells. Again, if I want to maybe apply some conditional formatting to selected cells just here, I've already set it up as a macro with the correct criteria. I'm going to use highlight cells, click Run, and there it goes. And then finally on the end here, we have something that's slightly different. This time I've assigned a macro to a little clickable button. So what I want to happen here is when I click on this button, it's going to run a macro which works out the percentage. So we have revenue and profit, and I want to see what percentage of the revenue the profit is. So if I click on this button, it runs a macro, and there I get my percentage figures. So quite a few different examples there of how macros can be used. And those are very basic examples. I'm really just doing one thing at a time there. Of course, you can make much more complex macros by combining lots of different tasks together, which is what we're going to do in a moment. So what we're going to take a look at first is VBA. So I want to explain VBA a little bit to you first before we start creating macros. So I'm going to keep this worksheet open in the background. Now, if you've never used VBA before, if you've never heard of it before, it basically stands for Visual Basic for Applications. And it's a programming language that you'll find across all of the Microsoft applications. It kind of sits there in the background and it's used for programming and also running things like applications. So when you create a macro in Excel, what you're essentially doing is you're creating a whole bunch of VBA code. Now, I will say that if you are an Excel user, you could go your entire life not touching VBA at all, and you'd probably be fine. But for people who maybe like to use macros and create their own macros, it is quite important to at least be able to understand what you're looking at so that you're able to make minor or even more complex edits and get your macros doing exactly what you want them to do. Now, before you even start to think about doing anything with macros or VBA, there's one important step that you need to take, and that is you need to make sure that you have your developer ribbon turned on in Excel. So you can see that I'm currently clicked on mine, and this is where you'll find in that code group all of the good stuff related to VBA and macros. Now, the developer tab isn't turned on by default in Excel. So if you can't see it there in your Excel, you're going to need to turn that ribbon on. So all you'll need to do here is go to File and go down to Options. Go to Customize Ribbon, and then on the right-hand side, make sure that you just have a tick in this little developer box just here, and then you should be able to see that ribbon. So once you have that ribbon up, this is where we can go in and pull up the VBA code that's sitting behind whatever Excel spreadsheet we currently have open. So to jump into the VBA code for this particular worksheet, I can click on this first button just here, the Visual Basic button, and there is a keyboard shortcut for that of Alt F11. So let's just click on it and see what we get. Now, the first thing you'll probably notice when this opens is it opens in a brand new window, and this window really does have a very old school look to it. If any of you on this call today are as old as I am and can remember all the way back before we had the nice shiny new ribbons in Microsoft applications, we kind of had a menu system. And this is kind of what you have in this VBA window. We have these menu drop downs running across the top as opposed to ribbons, and we have toolbars instead. Now, what I want to do here is really just start to introduce you to this VBA window, and then we're going to go and start creating some macros and then look at them in this area. Now, I've got a couple of little windows open in this VBA main window, and the first one is the VBA project window. Now, what you can see in here currently is at the top, it's showing me which workbook I have open. So you can see there it says Examples of Macros Copy, which is the workbook that's currently open. Underneath, we then have all of the different worksheets that I have in this workbook, and you can see the name of the worksheet in brackets after the sheet number. And the code for the macros that I've got stored are saved under this little modules folder. So all of your macro code will always be underneath modules. So if I double click on where it says module 1, it's basically going to load up the VBA code for all of the macros I have in this workbook. Now, I don't expect you to understand what we've got going on here, but because I've got about 8 or 9 macros, you can see them all split up here. So this first one, this is the macro for deleting those blank rows. I then have the next macro, which was applying accounting formatting. I then have the next one, which shows the format as table macro, so on and so forth. Okay, so reasonably straightforward to access that macro code. Underneath that, we then have a properties window. Now, currently, the properties window doesn't really have a great deal in here, but in general, this is where I come if I want to give my module a more meaningful name. So when you create new modules, or when they're created for you, when you start creating macros, they'll just be named module 1, module 2, module 3, so on and so forth. So I might want to give this module a name by modifying the name in the properties window down here. So maybe I just want to call this example, something like that, hit enter, and it just makes it a little bit easier for me to identify in this workbook. Now, these different windows, you can turn them off and on depending on which ones you find particularly useful. So if you want to close them down, you can just click the crosses. If you want to open up any other windows, if you go to View, this is kind of where you can see all of the different windows you can have open. And one that I am going to open, because we're going to take a look at this a bit later on, is the immediate window. Keyboard shortcut Control G. And you can see that that's now open, this little blank immediate window underneath my main bulk of code. And we're going to come back to this a bit later on, and I'm going to show you some ways that you can use this immediate window. For the time being, let's close down this VBA window now that we've had a little introduction to it, so it's not going to be as scary when we look at it a bit later on. We're going to close it down, and we're going to switch our focus to creating, running, and saving macros. So let's close this worksheet down. I'm not going to save it. And I'm going to switch to another worksheet. Let's open this one just here. Okay. So we're going to create our first macro. Now, currently on this page, this worksheet is labeled sales. I don't have anything on here. So what is our task here? Well, our task is going to be to create a weekly overview report by department. So maybe this is a report that you have to produce on a weekly basis and send to each of the heads of the department. Maybe it shows all the different sales teams and the amount of revenue they've generated, and that needs to go out to different heads of department. So maybe we need to put a nice heading onto this report first of all. So instead of doing this every single week, I can create a macro that's going to automate the process of putting a nice report heading at the top. Okay. Now, when it comes to recording a macro, there are a few different places you can go to. So let's take a look at that first of all. The first place you can go to start recording a macro is on the Developer tab. So once you have that turned on, in this code group, you'll see you have a Record Macro button. So that is the first place you can go to. You'll also find the Record Macro button randomly on the View tab in the Macros group at the end. You can see there, we also have somewhere we can go to start recording a macro. And the third place we can go to is actually all the way down in the status bar. If you cast your eyes right the way down to the bottom left-hand corner, can you see that little icon down there that I have? If I hover over, it's telling me no macros are currently recording. I can also click here to toggle or stop or start recording a macro. Now again, if you can't see that little icon in your status bar, all you need to do is right-click your mouse on the status bar and make sure you have macro recording ticked in there, and then you'll get that little icon. So you can use any of those methods to start recording your macro. Now, before we start recording, let's just run through the steps I want to take so you can see how I would do this manually. So what I want the macro to do is basically start in cell A1, and I want it to type in weekly overview, whoops, would help if I could spell, overview, sales report by department. What I then want the macro to do is select that first row, go to the Home tab. I want to change the font. I want to change the font size to something a little bit bigger. I want to change the background to a darker blue, and I'm going to change the font color to white, and I'm also going to give it a bottom border underline. And when the macro is finished, I want the cursor to end up in cell A5. So that's basically what I want the macro to do. You can see there, to do that, it's taking me 7 or 8 clicks of the mouse, different steps I have to do. So I can become a lot more efficient by creating a macro, which I just click once, and it does the entire thing for me. So let's backtrack and record this as a macro. I'm going to clear everything I have in row 1. I'm going to go up to my Developer tab, and I'm going to click Record Macro. And what you'll get when you click that button is it's going to ask you to give your macro a name to make it easily identifiable. So I'm going to give my macro a name. I'm going to call this report underscore heading. And it's really important when you are naming your macros that you don't have any spaces in there. So you want to make sure it's all one word, or you separate with underscores. What you can then do is you can assign a shortcut key to make it even quicker to execute that macro. Now, I will say with shortcut keys, you need to be a little bit careful here because you don't want to assign a macro to a shortcut key that's already in use in Excel. So don't assign a shortcut key like Control-C or Control-X or something like that. Excel will prompt you if you've used one that's already in use, but I tend to like to add in Shift because I find that most of the Control plus a letter shortcuts are already taken. So let's try Control-Shift-H, see if that works. I can then choose where I want to store this macro. And again, this is a really important point. If I choose to store this macro in this workbook, then it means that the macro is basically going to travel with this workbook. So if I was to send this workbook to Adam, for example, he will be able to run the macro because it's stored in the workbook and make changes to that macro. If I open a brand new workbook, I'm not going to have access to that macro because I've only stored it in this particular workbook. If I want macros that are available across all of my Excel workbooks, I would need to save it in my personal macro workbook. Okay, so that's the difference. That will make the macro available across all of the workbooks that you create. Now, in this example, I'm just going to stick with this workbook, and it's always good to add in a description so that other people who might be looking at these macros have an idea as to what this is going to do. So I'm going to add a quick description that says format the heading of the report, something short like that. As soon as I click OK here, I'm essentially recording my macro. So let's click on OK. What you'll notice is that on that developer tab in the code group, I now have a stop recording button because I'm actually recording a macro. Now, when it comes to recording macros, you don't have to worry about time lapse. So for example, I'm sitting here currently not really doing anything. The macro isn't recording the time lapse. It will only really start recording as I start clicking around on the screen. So don't worry if you start the macro and then you go off to get a coffee and come back 5 minutes later. You're not going to have a gap of 5 minutes in your macro when you run it. It's just going to start from when you click. So let's now go in and let's execute those different steps, what we want this macro to do. Well, I want it to start in cell A1, so I'm going to give cell A1 another little click. I'm then going to type in my title. So this was weekly overview report by department. I want to select row 1 up to home. I'm going to apply a different font. We're going to make it bigger. We're going to give it a blue background, change the font color to white, and give it a bottom border. And at this point, this is where you have to be careful when you're recording a macro. If I stop recording the macro now, when I run it again, I'm going to end with that first row selected as it is now. So it's always important that when you finish basically running your steps, you click your mouse somewhere else where you want your mouse to end. So I'm going to click in cell A4 so that first row isn't selected. That's all I need this macro to do. So now I can stop recording. So let's go back up to developer and click stop recording. Once you've created a macro, they get stored underneath this macros button at the top here. And again, we have a shortcut for that of Alt F8. Let's click it, and there is my macro. And as you create more and more macros in this workbook, you're going to see them listed down here. Now, if you want to, if you've got lots of different workbooks open and they've all got different macros in them, you can view the macros in all of your open workbooks. Or if that's starting to get a bit confusing, you can just view the macros that you have in this specific workbook. You'll also see from here, this is where I can run my macro from as well. So if I want to rerun these steps, I can just click on Run, or I can use whatever keyboard shortcut I've assigned to that macro. I also have buttons here which allow me to step into it, make changes, things like that. So that is where the macro is stored. Let's see if it works. Let's test it out. So I'm going to click on the Report tab at the bottom, and I'm going to test out my macro. Now I could use my keyboard shortcut, or I could jump into macros and I could click on Run. And there we go. It executes all of those steps, and you can see where my cursor has ended up in cell A4 because that's where the macro ended. Okay, so a very quick example of how easy it is to create your own macro. Now, something that I find that really confuses people, particularly when they're first learning macros, is this concept of absolute versus relative referencing in the context of macros. You might be used to that terminology in things like formulas, but maybe not so when it comes to macros. So let me show you what I mean. Now, by default, when you create a macro, Excel uses absolute referencing. So if I tell the macro I want to start in cell A1, it's always going to start that macro in A1. It's locked to that cell. If I tell the macro I want to finish in cell A4, it's always going to end in A4. So if I decide that I want to run this macro further down this worksheet, so maybe I want this heading to appear in row 20, I might think to myself, okay, well, let's click in cell A20 and rerun this macro. So let's go to macros and click run. it doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't rerun it where I'm clicked because it uses absolute referencing and it's locked to those specific cells. So people get a bit confused about that, but you can use relative referencing when it comes to macros. And you can probably see in the code group just here on the developer tab, there is a use relative references button. If we click on that, it means that we can basically run the macro in any part of the worksheet. Now, I just want to take a break here for a second, just a little interlude in case there are people on the call today who are a bit confused about even absolute and relative references in terms of formulas. So just to illustrate this point a little bit more about fixed references, let me just very quickly show you how absolute and relative works in terms of formulas. So if I had some numbers in my worksheet, let's just say I've got a few there, and let's just add some in here, like that, and maybe I want to add these up. I could do a simple sum calculation. I can select my cells, I can close the bracket, and I can hit enter. And then what I can do to make my life easier is drag the formula down, and everything works nicely because Excel uses relative referencing by default. And what we mean by that is that as I move the formula down, Excel moves those cell references down, so it's always correct. That is relative referencing. Absolute referencing, when it comes to formulas, is slightly different. If I had maybe something like a tax rate over here of 15%, and I want to do a quick sum calculation and work out what 15% is of whatever is in D10, I can do D10 multiplied by K9. Now, if I was just to use relative reference in here and drag this formula down, it's going to be okay when I drag it down for this cell here, D11, but this reference is also going to move down one cell, so it will be referring to a blank cell. So in this case, we have to lock it to cell K9 by pressing the F4 key to make it relative. Oops, what have I done there? Let's do that again. F4, close the bracket. And that means it's now absolute and it's always going to refer to that specific cell. Okay, so that is absolute versus relative in terms of formulas, in case you weren't aware. A similar thing happens when we're using macros. So let's see an example of relative referencing in action. What I'm going to do is I'm going to type out the sales teams and how much revenue they've generated. Now, before I record the macro, I'm going to make sure I turn on Use Relative Referencing. Let's click Record Macro. I'm going to give my macro a name, so let's call this sales underscore figures. I could assign it a keyboard shortcut. I'm not, just to save a little bit of time. I'm going to store it in this workbook. And again, I'm not going to give it a description to save a bit of time, but I definitely recommend that you do that. When I click on OK, I'm now recording my macro. So what do I want to do here? Well, we want to type in sales team 1, sales team 2, sales team 3, sales team 4, and then I want to have the revenue generated. So let's just say 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000. And maybe I also want to apply some currency formatting to these figures. And then I want the macro to end in cell A4. Let's stop recording our macro. Click on macros. There it is, the sales figures macro. So now let's try running this. I'm going to go across to my reports. I'm going to click in cell A5. I'm going to go to macros and run the macro, and it adds those sales figures in. If I click somewhere else on the worksheet and again run the macro, it works over here as well. So it's not locking it to one specific location. I can basically use this macro in any part of the worksheet. Okay, so that is the advantage of using relative referencing. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. All right, so now we kind of understand that concept. Let's move on to creating a little bit more of a complex macro, which basically involves us performing lots of different tasks. So I'm going to close down this worksheet and I'm going to open up, let's open up Which one do I want? Complex macros. Okay. Now with this one here, what I've done is I've actually written out what I want to do in a little instruction box on the side. Now you don't have to do that, but I would recommend if you plan on recording a macro that contains a lot of steps, so maybe it's a very complex macro, I would advise that you do kind of make a note of the different steps before you record the macro, because there's nothing worse than kind of getting partway through the recording of your macro and then maybe forgetting where a specific command is and hunting through all the ribbons, maybe clicking on the wrong thing. You don't want all of that recorded in your macro, so make sure that you're kind of fairly set on where you need to click prior to recording. So just to remind myself, I've put a little instruction box up there. Another thing that is so important when you are recording macros is that I would always advise that you make a backup copy of your worksheet. So for example, you can see at the bottom here, I have complex macros and complex macro 2. And some cases, I will always make a third copy as well, because what you'll find is that when you run your macro, you can't easily back out of it. So if you've made a mistake with your macro and it goes a bit wrong, you can't click the undo button to come out of that macro. You can't undo it. So I like to make sure I have a couple of copies of my worksheet in its original form, so that if everything does go a little bit wrong when I run the macro, I always have backup copies. So I'm going to take 2 backup copies just to be on the safe side. Now let's take a look at what we want this macro to do. The first thing I want it to do is I want it to split up the customer name into 2 different columns, so first name and last name. Then I want it to remove the 3 zeros from the front of the order number. I then want it to remove the hyperlinks from the email addresses, and then I want it to only show the last 4 digits of the credit card number, and I want the rest of the credit card number to be in asterisks. And yes, I know all of the credit card numbers are exactly the same number. I only noticed that just before I did this session, so don't worry too much about that. We're just going to change the formatting of them. And then the final thing I want to do here is I want to auto fit the entire table to the column width. So I have a few different steps that I want to record in my macro. So let's jump up to the developer tab. And if I want to use this again, I can use relative references if I want to do exactly this process on another set of data. So let's turn that on. Why not? Let's click Record Macro and give our macro a name. So I'm going to call this Format Customer Table. I could give my macro a keyboard shortcut, so something like Control-Shift-T. I'm going to store it in this workbook, and I would probably, normally, outside of a webinar, give this a description. Click on OK, and I am now into recording my macro. So what's the first thing we need to do here? We want to split up the customer name into 2 columns, first name and last name. So I'm going to insert a new column. I'm going to select all of the names, and I'm going to use text to columns. I have delimited data, and my data, or the names, are separated with a space. And you can see just underneath how it's going to split those names at the space in between the names. Click on Finish, and it splits them up. I can now just rename or type in a name for these headings. So we want first name and last name. That is task 1 complete. The next thing I want to do is I want to remove the 3 zeros from this order number. And to do that, I'm going to use the Flash Fill utility in Excel. So once again, I'm going to insert a new column. And with Flash Fill, all you need to do is basically type what you want to keep. So I want to keep the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I'm going to use the Flash Fill button in the Data Tools group to fill the rest of those down for me. What I can then do is just copy these and paste them over the top, and I'm going to do a paste special to paste just the values. And then I can delete that column. The next thing we need to do is remove the hyperlinks from the email addresses. So this is a fairly straightforward process of selecting the cells, right-click the mouse, and at the bottom, remove hyperlinks. And then the final thing I want to do here is I want to only show the last 4 digits of the credit card number, and I want everything else to appear in asterisks. Now, as I'm going through this, I'm not particularly too worried about you understanding exactly all of the different techniques I'm using in Excel. This is really just to show you an example of a more complex macro. So the final thing I want to do here is just show these last 4 digits. So I'm going to use a little bit of a formula. We're going to type in equals, and in quote marks, I'm going to say I want asterisk, asterisk, dash, dash. And then we're going to basically concatenate using the right function, text in cell F6, and I want to pull out the last 4 characters. And that should give me the format that I'm looking for these credit card numbers. I can then Control-C to copy that, and I'm going to paste it over the top so that I get the correct credit card number values, and I can then delete that column. The final thing I want to record in my macro is just to auto-fit the entire table. So I'm going to select the entire table, go up to Format, and I'm going to say Auto-Fit Column Width. And that is it. And remember, where do you want your mouse to end up? Well, I'm going to say I want my macro to end in cell A2. So now I can go up to Developer and say Stop Recording. And that is my macro recorded. So now we can test it out and see if it works. So everybody keep your fingers crossed, because one false move, and you never know with these, they can go completely wrong. But let's give it a go. I'm going to click on macros. There is my macro. I've switched across to the copy. So this is what it looked like originally. So now you should see this change with all of those formatting changes. Let's click on Run. Quick as a flash, it went through, and now we have all of that data formatted. So imagine if this set of tasks was something you had to do frequently, how much time that takes compared to doing it once and recording it as a macro and then just being able to rerun it. It makes your life a lot more efficient and a lot easier. Okay, let's close this down and let's take a look at another example. Now this time we are going to assign a macro or a few macros to some buttons or form controls in this case. And the first thing I'm going to do here with this table of data is I'm just going to add some filters onto the top. Now, the cool thing with macros is that you can assign them to different things. So for example, you can assign a macro to a shape, you can assign it to an icon, a picture, a form control, anything like that. So if I want to make this worksheet really interactive and easy for people to understand, instead of them having to go in and mess around trying to run macros from the Developer tab, I could just create a very simple little button that says Filter by HR Department. And I can attach a macro to that, which is going to execute those steps. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to create 3 buttons at the top here. The first button is going to sort this data by department, A to Z, and then by hire date, newest to oldest. I'm going to create a second button that is going to filter this list so that I can only see people in the HR team. And then the third button I'm going to create is going to be a button that clears any filters that I've applied to this data. So I want to create 3 different buttons, so that requires 3 different macros. So let's jump up to the Developer tab and click on Record Macro. I'm going to give my first macro a name, and this one is going to be the macro that sorts by department and hire date. So I'm going to call it Sort by Department Hire. I could assign a shortcut. I'm not going to do that for just to make things a little bit quicker, and click on OK. Now I'm recording my macro. Let's run through those steps. I'm going to go to the Data tab. We're going to click on Sort. I'm going to say I want to sort by the department, A to Z, and then by the hire date, but I want to sort it by newest to oldest, and click on OK. That is the first macro. So let's jump up to Developer and click Stop Recording. Let's record our second macro. Straight back into Record Macro. This time I want a macro that's going to filter by the HR department, and click on OK. So now I just need to click the filter drop down. I'm going to deselect everything, select HR, and click on OK. And that is the end of this macro. Stop recording. The final macro I want to record is a macro that's basically going to clear any filters that I've applied and reset this back to how it was originally. So once again, we're going to record macro, and this macro is going to be called clear filters, and click on OK. So for this one, we just need to go to the data tab, and I'm going to say clear. Very straightforward macro. Stop recording. So now if I open up the macros pane, you can see all three of those macros that I've created. Now that I have them there, I can basically create buttons and assign macros to those buttons. Now, when it comes to creating little buttons on your worksheet, as I said, there are a few different ways you could do it. You might want to use something like a shape. So I could grab a little rounded rectangle and maybe draw a little button up here, add some text, change the color, whatever I want to do. And if I want to assign a macro to make this a clickable button, all I need to do is right click and I have an assign macro option just here. And I can go in and choose which macro I want to execute when this button is clicked. Now, I'm not going to do it for a shape. You could also assign macros to things like icons. So if you want to make this a little bit more interesting to look at, you can select an icon from the gallery. And if you right click, you can assign a macro from the contextual menu in there as well. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use form controls to create some buttons. And again, you'll find form controls on the developer tab. They're in this controls group. If we click the insert drop down, I'm going to choose this first one here, which is a button form control. And I'm just going to draw this little button up the top there. And straight away, it asks me to assign a macro. So I'm going to assign the sort by sort by department and hire date. Click on OK. I can then rename my button. Sort by department and hire date. Let's create another button. And again, you can take a lot more time than I am creating these and making them look nice, but I'm going to assign this filter by HR department macro. I'm going to give this a name as well. So a filter by HR department. And I'm going to move that. Whoops. These are sometimes a little bit tricky to move. There we go. And move that across there. And then the final one we're going to create is just going to be one that clears all of the filters. So this can be a smaller one, clear filters. And once again, we can just call that clear all, something like that. And again, I'm just going to move that across. So now that we have our buttons, let's see them in action. Now I'm just going to mess up this data a little bit. Let's reorder this in a slightly different way. So now, if I click on my first button, it sorts it by department and then by hire date. I can then filter by the HR department, and then I can clear all to take it back to how it was. So that's an example of how you can combine macros with buttons to make something that's really interactive and easy for people to use. So now we have all of that in mind. We've seen a few examples of how we can create macros and how we can record them. The final point I really want to cover here in relation to macros is saving your worksheets. Now you'll notice that all these macros that I've created, I'm working in a workbook that it just has the file extension .xlsx. Now you'll find that if I go to save this, I've actually purposely turned off autosave so it didn't keep popping up a message. But if I go to save this, it's going to recognize that I now have macros stored in this workbook, and it's going to ask me to save this file as a macro enabled workbook. So that's something you must always do. If you do have macros in your workbook, you're going to need to save it and just go down to File, Save as a different file type. So where it says Save as Type, you're going to need to save it as this, a .xlsm, a macro enabled workbook. And what this will essentially do is if you were to send this to somebody else, depending on the settings that they have in relation to macros, it's going to prompt them. So when they open up the workbook, it's going to tell them that the workbook contains macros, and they're going to get a choice as to if they want to continue opening it, because sometimes it has been known in the past that malicious code has sometimes been delivered and passed around using macro code. So now we have these little warning signs come up asking us if we're okay to proceed. Okay, so just remember the different file type you need to save in if you have macros in your workbook. Now we have about 10 minutes left, and just to finish off, I just want to focus a bit more on that VBA editor. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump back in and open up the VBA editor window that we were looking at earlier. Now, if you remember, the keyboard shortcut to quickly open it up is Alt plus F11, or alternatively, from the Developer tab, you can just click the big old Visual Basic button at the side there. And I'm just going to display these side by side so that we can see them easily. Now let's take a closer look at what we're looking at just here. So again, in this project window, you can see at the top, it's telling me that I have the Sort and Filter macro workbook open. It's then showing me the different sheets. I only have one sheet, and that sheet is called Sort and Filter. And then, of course, because I've got macros contained in here, I have a modules folder. And if I double click on module 1, this is the code for these 3 macros that I created. So you can see at the top here, there is my sort by department, there is my filter macro, and at the bottom, there is my clear filters macro. And once again, I could go in and using the properties window at the bottom, I could give this a more meaningful name. So I might want to say sort. I'm going to use underscore sort and filter macros, just so I know what they are. Now, the thing I want to focus on in this particular section is I just want to go back to taking a quick look at this immediate window at the bottom, because there are a couple of different things you can do in here. And if you start working quite frequently in this Visual Basic window, then the immediate window can be quite useful. Now, there are so many different uses for this immediate window, and I would encourage you to look up more information on this online if it's of interest to you. But basically, what you can do down here is you can ask the immediate window questions. So, for example, if I want to maybe find out how many worksheets I have in this workbook, I can ask the immediate window. And if you want to ask the immediate window a question, you put a question mark at the front there. And what I can say is if I wanted to count the worksheets, if I type in worksheets, dot, you can see I then get some choices. I'm going to say count, like so. And when I hit enter, it tells me that I have 1 worksheet. If I want to find out, maybe I'm clicked on, let's say cell E8. If I want to find out what the number formatting is of the cell I'm currently clicked on, I could say, okay, let's ask it a question. I'm going to type in active cell dot, and then I can say, what's the number format? And it's going to show me. What if I'm clicked on a cell that contains text? Well, if I rerun this, if I type the same question in again, active cell dot number format, and hit enter, it's telling me I have general formatting applied. What if I want to find out what's actually in a cell? Well, I could say, okay, question, range, open bracket, tell me what is in cell A7. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's giving me the value in cell A7. So you can ask it questions like that. Obviously, we've just barely scratched the surface. There are so many different things you can do with it, but hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of some of the things you can ask. Another use for this immediate window is that it allows you to essentially run pieces of code, maybe practice pieces of code prior to adding them into your main macro at the top. If you want to edit your macros, you might want to try out a piece of code prior to actually adding it into your macro code. So you can do things like that down here in the immediate window as well. And just to give you an example of that, if I decided that I wanted to have all of these headings centered, I could test out the piece of VBA code. Now, again, I don't expect you to remember this, but just so you can see how this works, what I could do is type in selection, because I have some cells selected. I could say horizontal alignment equals Excel center across selection. And you'll see when I execute that piece of code, it's going to align all of those into the center of the cell. So I know that that bit of code is working. I might then want to transfer it up into the window above and apply it or add it into my macros. So another really good place where you can test out code. So with all of that said, let's take a look at the VBA editor a little bit closer whilst we run a macro. So I'm going to close down this worksheet and we're going to open up this final worksheet just here. And this is the final little exercise that we're going to do before we finish up. Now what I have here is I just have again some data, and maybe this is a little report of software sales and I have to send this report to 2 different clients. And maybe one client likes the report to be formatted in Segoe UI font. And maybe the other client prefers this report to be formatted in Lato font. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 2 macros that switches between those fonts depending on which client I'm sending this to. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the VBA window again so you can see what happens as we record a macro. So let's jump into Visual Basic and I'm going to arrange these windows so that they're side by side. Now what you'll notice here is again in this VBA project window at the top, it's telling me that I'm in the change font workbook, which I am. I have one sheet, which is the sales sheet. Now you can see that I don't have a folder called modules because I don't have any macros recorded yet. That modules folder gets automatically created when you start creating a macro, and you'll see it appear in here as I start to run one. Now for the time being, I don't need the immediate window, so I'm just going to close that down and give myself a little bit more space. So what we're going to do is we're going to record the first macro, which is going to change all of the font on this worksheet to Segoe UI, and we're also going to make these subtotals and headings bold. So on the Developer tab, let's go to the code group, and you can see now because my window is a bit smaller, my icons or commands have shrunk down. Record macro. I'm going to call this one change underscore font underscore Segoe UI. Again, you can do the shortcut key, all of that malarkey if you want to. I'm not going to. Click on OK. Now look in the VBA project window. Now that I'm recording, can you see a modules folder has been created? And this is where the macro code is going to go into. So let me run through my macro recording. I want to select the entire worksheet. I then want to go to the Home tab and I want to change to Segoe UI font. So that should be all the way towards the bottom. Where are we? Where are we? There we are, like so. What I also want to do is I want to make these headings bold. I want to make these subtotals bold. And if we scroll down, I want to make the subtotal and the grand total bold as well. And you can see here the column isn't quite wide enough, so I'm going to widen out that column by double clicking. I'm going to scroll to the top because I want my macro to end in cell A4. Let's go to the Developer tab and stop recording the macro. Now that we've recorded that one macro, let's take a look at the code that it's created. So I'm going to expand the modules folder and double click on module 1. And there is my macro. Now let's take a quick look and read through this code, because even if you're not all that familiar or you find things like this quite daunting, you don't really have to be a programmer to kind of get an idea as to what this code is doing. Now what you'll find is when you are looking at a piece of VBA code, based on a macro, the macro will have a structure. So it's always going to start with sub and then the name of the macro. And you'll also find at the bottom, it's going to have end sub, and sub just stands for subroutine. What we then have underneath is some text in green. And you'll see that there is an apostrophe at the beginning. Now, anything you see with an apostrophe at the beginning showing in green is a comment. So it's not a piece of code that runs. So if you want to add comments or notes into a macro, maybe to help other people who are editing the macro, then you can. Just make sure that you put an apostrophe in front of it so that VBA doesn't think it's a piece of code that it needs to try and run. So what I could do here is I could type in an apostrophe, and I might want to say something like, this is just for the sales team. When I click away, you'll see that that changes to green. So green are comments. What I then have is cells.select. So this line of code is basically when I selected the entire worksheet. What I then did is I changed the font to Sego UI. So after we've selected the cells, we then changed the selection font to Sego UI. And there is that line of code. Now, what you'll notice underneath this kind of whole section just here, basically what the VBA editor does is it then runs through a whole bunch of other font properties, and it basically says, no, I don't want to turn that one on. No, 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 which is kind of seems a little bit pointless. You might as well have just left them out. But essentially, because all I've done here is change the font, I haven't asked for strike through, superscript or anything. This section of code is pretty much not needed. So I could delete this out and the macro is still going to work fine. Okay, so just be aware of that. We are going to delete these out in a moment. What we then have is after we change the font, what I then did is I started making cell selections to change the headings and the subtotals to bold. So you can see here it says range A6 to E6 select, which was this range just here. And then it says selection font bold equals true. So it's basically toggling on bold. It then says range A19 to E19, which is when I made this selection down here. And the same thing, selection font bold equals true. It then says active windows, scroll down. And that is when I scrolled down to the bottom and then selected the next cell range A32 to E33. And then again, we applied bold font. I then double clicked to widen out column E. And that is what we have just there, column E, entire column, auto fit. And then I scrolled up, so we have a scroll, and then it says range A4 select, and that is where I basically wanted the macro to end up. So even if you don't know VBA, it's fairly simple to read through this macro. And once you start understanding your macro code, you can then start making basic changes to the code. So a simple change I could make here would be instead of ending up in cell A4, maybe I want the cursor to end in cell F1. So I could simply come down to here and I'm going to change the cell reference from A4 to F1. Now, if I want to just run this piece of code, what I can do is click at the top where it says sub, and then just above on the toolbar, we have a little play button. That's just going to run that particular sub. So note when I click play, my cursor is basically going to run the same macro, but it should end up in cell F1, which it does. And you can then go through and you can make any changes you want to different cell ranges. So fairly straightforward to make minor modifications like that. What if I wanted to run another macro? Let's hit enter. Maybe when I send this to another client, they want a different style of font. So I'm going to record another macro. I'm going to call this change underscore font underscore Lato and click on OK. Note what's happening in the code window as I'm doing this. It's created the sub, it's given it the name, and now I can go through my different steps. So I want to select everything again. Note the code being built, cells.select. Go to the Home tab, and I'm going to change it this time to Lato font. So let's find it in the list. There it is. Keep an eye on the code window. You can see it selects it, puts all that other stuff in, and that's all I really want to do here. I don't need to change it to bold because it's already in bold, but I do want my cursor to end up in cell F1 this time. Go to developer, stop recording the macro. So you can see there how that's been built up in this code window. What I could then do is go through and start making different changes. So as I said, I don't really need the rest of these font properties. So I could delete this out. Now, I would say that when it comes to deleting things out of the code, I would always say to add an apostrophe at the front just to comment it out first. So before you delete it, this will prevent that piece of code or that line of code from actually running, so that maybe if it doesn't quite work out, you can just very simply put it back again. But I know that this works, so I'm going to delete out all of this code. And I'm going to start tidying my code up a little bit. I can grab this and I might want to move it to just here. And now that I only have one property, I don't really need to have this with statement. And I can delete this one out and just make things look a little bit tidier. I want to make sure that this still works now that I've made some changes. If I click at the beginning and click play, yes, that code still works. So I can then go through and delete out exactly the same thing for this stuff at the bottom. The final thing I want to show you before we finish up, because I am aware we're about 4 minutes over, again, a couple of other little changes we could make. Maybe I decide that instead of changing the font to bold, I also want to change it to italics. So what I could do is I could edit this code where it says selection font.bold equals true. If I maybe just want to have it in italics and not bold, I could change that to false. And I could add another line of code underneath. I'm going to copy and paste. I could say instead I want font.italic to be true. And then what I would need to do is I would need to copy that to wherever I want that to apply. So currently I've only set it for this up here, but if I also wanted that to apply down here, I would copy those 2 lines of code further down here as well. Now, just because we don't have much time, I'm just going to leave it like that. And then if I go back and run this piece of code, you can see what it does there. It's now no longer in bold, it's in italics. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a little bit of an idea as to the types of things. It's getting you used to the VBA window, types of little mini changes you can make, and how it's not particularly difficult to kind of understand what's going on. And of course, as I said, you can spend your entire life never having to go into this code. You can just run macros using the recorder. But as you get more and more advanced with macros, you'll find that you want to get your macros to start doing lots of weird and wonderful things. Sometimes that will require you to go in and start writing VBA code. So it's always a good idea to have a little bit of knowledge. Now, I know I keep saying I'm going to finish. The very final thing I want to show you is just how to make your life a lot easier by adding your macros to your quick access toolbar. So don't forget, if you've created a lot of macros, you could even set up your own macros ribbon at the top. I don't have time to show you how to do that, but another quick way of being able to execute them is you could add them to your quick access toolbar. So what I can do here is go down to more commands. I'm going to choose macros. Those are my macros, and I can add both of those across to my quick access toolbar, like so. And if I want to, I can give them a nice little icon. So let's just give them this icon, and let's give this one this icon just here. Click on OK, and now I have my macro buttons just here, and I can execute those as I please. So that just makes it a lot more efficient for you.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the files the instructor used in this tutorial and follow along, click over there. And click over there to watch more videos on YouTube from Simon Sez IT.